this is something that I had on my mind for some time. I do think that there are some pretty spicy takes out there, and I figured I might as well tackle them. What I mean with this is that, of course, you have your spicy takes and people that, discuss and kind of contemplate whether, their opinions are valid or if they join the majority with their opinion. And I do feel to a certain degree that the opinions that I have here are somewhat common in some circles, but in most circles that I look, that I'm aware of, that the forums that I read, these are some pretty spicy takes. So do keep that in mind that this is a list of my hot takes. I'm not saying that these are the objective, subjective, or the objective hot takes, and these are all facts. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying these are my opinions that I consider hot takes. That's kind of what a hot take is. You know, I feel like clarifying that because not everyone is aware that what a hot take actually is. You can Google it. I can Google it right now. There are some kind of brainlets on here that are not aware of that, but let's just look at the definition. Because the internet can be dense. I'm not saying everyone, but there can be some dense people in the crowd, so there you go. A piece of commentary typically produced quickly in response to a recent event whose primary purpose is to attract attention. I mean, that's not how I would describe it personally, but I would just say a unpopular opinion. So, yeah. I mean, I think I agree more with this. And what would this say? A piece of writing or speech, especially on the internet, giving someone's personal opinions about a topic, usually strong opinions that have not been carefully thought about and that many people are likely to disagree with. Um, I'm also not sure if I would agree with this, but I do agree with the last line though, about and that many people are likely to disagree with. So just unpopular opinions. There are many kind of takes out there that you could call this, but let's just call it unpopular opinions. So I've thought about it. I've written them down. I have notes. So let's just start with I have 5 honorable mentions, and then I would go into the top 10. You know, they are kind of ranked on how controversial they are. So I'll just start with the fifth honorable mention, or the first one. I would consider Colors better than Jane Doe. And if you are not aware of these bands and these albums, Colors is a progressive metalcore album from the band Between the Buried and Me. And Jane Doe is a bit more famous. It's from the band Converge. And, that's not to take credit away from Converge. Converge is a great band. I love that band. But when I listen to it, it's kind of ear shattering. It's kind of just pierces through your ears like kind of like a needle. And it is a pretty aggressive and direct album, which I love. I love direct music like that. That's why I'm a metalhead. But I'm not always in that mood. And with Colors, I'm more like I find it very easy to throw on. There's a lot of melody, it has a lot of progression, but it also just hits like a freight train. So it kind of has that Jane Doe punch, but it also has the kind of softer, tender side with the melodies that I love. So in that essence, I think it is the perfect metalcore album in that sense. So I've always personally enjoyed it more. I've kind of listened to it more. I find it easier to throw on. So it's my personal preference, so I think it's better. But Jane Doe, it's still like the objective, the universal greatest metalcore album ever. And I love it for that. I think it's a great album, but In my opinion, Colors is just a tidbit better. Both great bands, both great albums, but I'm personally more of a Colors fan. The second is definitely way more controversial. I personally think that Porcupine Tree has a more enjoyable catalog than most prog bands. And the reason for this is that I think that, influential, like great bands like Yes and King Crimson, they have a lot of material that is good. They have their first era, which is pretty good. The late 60s and the 70s era is definitely influential and great. But most of those albums are just one thing. They're just prog rock. And that's kind of generalizing it, because they've definitely done more than that. They have they have a psych rock era. They have a bit of psychedelia, a bit of alternative scenes. King Crimson even turned kind of metal later, but that was way later. So there are definitely a lot of sounds in those bands. That's why they are progressive. Otherwise they wouldn't be. So I'm not taking credit away from them, but bands like Gentle Giant and Camel, they're a bit more. Well, Gentle Giant is not conventional, quote unquote, but I feel like that's like traditional prog, and I think traditional prog is great. But what you see with most of those bands, like with what's that band called again? With the brain salad surgery, that shit. I haven't listened to that shit in forever. But the brain salad surgery band, that band had kind of a couple of great albums, and then they struggled in like the 80s, and then they just sold out with a pop album, kind of the Beach Boys thing. Emerson, Lake and Palmer, there you go. Bands like that. I think they're kind of like, you can put them in a box pretty easy. And with Porcupine Tree, you can't really do that, because they have like a psych rock era, then they have a space rock era, then they have another album which is like definitely their most spacious album ever. Then they are a psych rock band, then they are alternative, then they're pop, then they have a prog metal era, then they have a conceptual era. So I'm like, there are so many elements to Porcupine Tree's music. And for me, it never really grows old, and they never really had like a dip in quality. It's kind of is like a step up. Like every album got better, and I think for that reason, it's very enjoyable to just keep listening to that catalog, because Porcupine Tree just got better and better, whereas with most prog bands, they got worse and worse. Like with Yes and King Crimson. King Crimson arguably peaked at their debut. Yes peaked in the 70s. Emerson peaked in the 70s. Gentle Giant peaked in the 70s. So there are not really any bands that are like, I would say, that have tied as a discography as Porcupine Tree. I'm not even calling them better. If I am gonna call them better, I would just lie, because that's not true. So I don't think Porcupine Tree is a better band, but I think that Porcupine Tree has the more enjoyable catalog, if that makes sense. I find it very easy to return to any of their albums. Throw a dart at any of their albums and you will have a good time. Whereas with, Yes, if you throw a dart at like a 90s album, you're in pain. You're suffering. Like, that shit sucks, bro. I'm like, even the 80s era, I'm like, 80s Yes is kind of iffy. 90s Yes is unlistenable, in my opinion. 70s Yes is fucking great. So I'm like, yeah, if I throw a dart at that, I'm going to have a great time. But, there are so many misses. And with Porcupine Tree, I would argue that all of their albums are a hit. Even arguably the first album, because it's so experimental and it has so many kind of weird tracks on it, that even that album, I would argue, is enjoyable. So, yeah, take it or leave it. That's kind of a spicy take, but that's why it's an honorable mention. I think, it is semi-controversial, but, not controversial enough for the list, because you would have to know what Porcupine Tree even is. Most people don't know that band, so it's kind of a hidden gem, I would argue. Pink Floyd, Yes, King Crimson, but they all have kind of stinkers in their catalog, and Porcupine Tree doesn't, I think so. There you go. In my opinion, the third one is outlaw country and western are the best country. Today doesn't compare. I mean, I put that in quotation or in parentheses because that's kind of obvious. Modern country is just kind of shit. Old country and stuff like that. You have in the classic era in like the 50s, 60s, and 70s. You had, of course, Willie Nelson, who is like a legend. He is like an outlaw country legend. So I'm like, that's just way more enjoyable, I think. And of course, I would say my personal favorite is Trill Songs by Marty Robbins, who I constantly keep hearing in Fallout. I play it a lot, so I always just hear Big Iron on his hip, and I'm always in the mood to listen to it. I'm like, yeah, that's a very catchy song, and you have, of course, El Paso on that, and then lots. They're hanging me tonight. I'm like, yeah, it has kind of a twang, but it also has like a lot of emotional undertones. So I'm like, country has a country has a lot of depth. Classic country, like actual traditional country, has a lot of depth in their music, and I'm like, yeah, it's actually really catchy and good. So I would say that those are the best genres of country. I'm calling that kind of a semi hot take because people in general don't really listen to country. But I do think that that is fantastic country right there. If you are gonna listen to a country album, then definitely Trill Songs by Marty Robbins or any Willie Nelson album is also great. Shotgun Willie, I believe, is also one of his. So just great country in general. Just avoid anything modern. Johnny Cash, I'm like, it's kind of mediocre to me. And derivatives of that, I believe that Geese or something is like an alt country band. I'm like, I'm not buying it, mate. I'm just like, just give me classic country. I'm good with that. So that might be somewhat of a hot take, but I know that most people don't listen to country, so that's just kind of like a me take, I suppose. You know, Country fans already know that, and people that are not into country, I'm not gonna convince, but the classic stuff is definitely better. If you are gonna give it a shot, definitely start with the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the best era of country. My fourth hot take, which is a bit more spicy, Steve Roach and Robert Rich are better than Brian Eno. And if you don't know Steve Roach and Robert Rich, they are essentially kind of collaborators. They've collaborated on a couple of projects. And, Steve Roach is definitely the more influential artist because he's been around for like 40 years. And these are all ambient artists. Steve Roach is more into the kind of spacious tribal ambient, whereas Robert Rich is more into the dark, kind of droning soundscapes. And I do tend to prefer Robert Rich, but I know that Steve Roach is like, I would argue that he is the greatest ambient artist because I just think he makes the most complete sounding albums. Whereas with Brian Eno, I hear his albums, and I think that Brian Eno is a great gateway to ambient. But sometimes I just kind of find this material kind of weak or incomplete, or it sounds a bit muffled or just outdated. I have that with Steve Roach as well, but I do think that Steve Roach has a more complete sound, whereas with Brian Eno, it kind of feels like you have to listen to multiple parts of his ambient series to really get the whole picture with Brian Eno. And, if you listen to those fucking Steve Roach albums, those can last for like 5 hours or like 4 hours. I believe Robert Rich recorded an ambient album that goes over like 6, 7 hours of music. So that's fucking insane. That's like he almost created it for like a sleep for like a sleep session, 6, 7 hours. So that's kind of mad. Yeah, but I still think it sounds better than Brian, so that's my opinion. Not to diss Brian, he's a great producer. I think his production style is great. The way he produces and innovates bands is definitely great. but I just don't think he is the greatest ambient artist, in my opinion. I think he is one of the greatest producers, though, so I'm not gonna throw flag there, but not really a fan of his actual music. But production, he's great. So keep producing, you know. And the song Brian Eno by MGMT, I also think it's kind of more enjoyable than any Brian Eno song in and of itself. But that's subjective, of course. That's my opinion. An unpopular one at that. And my fifth and last somewhat spicy take, which is arguable. I would say the top 10 is all hot takes. But this one is the less arguable one, which, you know, this is going to get debated until the end of time. But I think personally, you can separate the art from the artist. And this is a very, very controversial opinion, I think, because most people, you know, they see Morrissey or Kanye West and they're like, yeah, those people are cunts. And I can't separate that because their personality is their music. And I'm like, yeah, you know, I enjoy some Smiths. I think that, you know, The Queen is Dead, I still enjoy that album from time to time. From time to time I still enjoy it, but I don't think you know, I don't hear Morrissey's voice and I'm like, oh, it's ruined. I'm like, yeah, sounds fitting to the music, you know. I know it's over and the title track and there's a light that never goes out. I'm like, yeah, that sounds fucking great, you know. Morrissey thinks that the Chinese are a subspecies. I'm like, yeah, he can think that. I don't care, you know. I still like the music, you know. It doesn't ruin the music for me. So you know, that's my opinion. I think that's kind of speaks for itself because you know his opinions don't influence the music. That those are two separate boxes, you know. And I saw a Dozer Buckley, and he described Kanye West made like a song about his nephew came out this year, I believe. And he said, "I gave my 6 year old cousin head." And I'm like, yeah, you know, Kanye West is you know his brain is melted. I'm like, yeah, that dude is a fucking psychopath. But you know, um, he made graduation. He made what else did he make? You know, Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. He made The College Dropout. He made, yeah, you know, those albums. I'm like, yeah, you know, I know that he is fucking psycho, but I still enjoy those albums. I'm still like, yeah, his catalog is great, you know, despite his modern material being, you know, he's being a Nazi sympathizer and like, you know, a pedophile and arguably, you know, he is incestuous. I'm like, yeah, Kanye is insane, but that's why his music is great, you know? So he has insane actions. He is incestuous, you know? I don't promote that lifestyle, but the music is great. I'm like, yeah, I can separate those two. I can put them in separate boxes. I'm like, yeah, the music is great, but Kanye is an awful person. I'm like, it's not difficult to do that. I'm like, you know, if you hear Kanye, does that ruin My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy? Does that ruin The College Dropout? Does that ruin Graduation? Because he was in a different mindset back then. He was, you know, less insane. He was insane enough to make those albums, you know? I'm like, yeah, that's recorded history right there. That doesn't, you know, what he's saying now, that doesn't temper what he does. That doesn't temper his albums. You know, unless he goes back and re-records them, you know, then he would ruin it. But I don't want to give him ideas. So I think it's pretty easy to separate the art from the artist. You know, I can do it. I still think that music is enjoyable. But if you can't, I think you're giving yourself a hard time for no reason. You know, it's not difficult. I can do it. Anyone could do it. You know, it's not difficult. So just do it. You know, would be a great slogan. So that was the honorable mentions. 20 minutes in. That's how I go here. Now for the actual top 10. Number 10. Rammstein is a gimmick. I don't think they are an actual band, in my opinion. I think that Rammstein is kind of a stage gimmick, you know. Their shows are pretty bombastic and colorful, and they are very grandeur-ish, if that's even a word, ambitious. They are very grand, very big. But if you have to compensate for those shows, what does that say about your music? That's what I think, at least. Not to say that Rammstein is a terrible band or something, but the stage antics and just how they dress up and you know what they do on stage does not reflect the quality of their music. If I go to the industrial metal chart, you can see it right now, but you know, I would argue Nine Inch Nails is more influential. They have more, progressive styles. They have more innovative sounds. So I just think that Nine Inch Nails is more influential and better. If you think that Rammstein is heavy, that their industrial riffs are heavy, then you haven't heard Fear Factory. Fear Factory is just way heavier. So, you know, Fear Factory also has that. If you want to argue that, Nine Inch Nails has more progression. They have like their rock sounds, and they can be a bit more metal. Especially in the early days. And if you want to talk about the actual goats of industrial, Nine Inch Nails, Fear Factory, you could debate that, but I would argue the actual goat of industrial metal is Godflesh. A Godflesh with that first album, Street Cleaner, amazing. Like the sludgy riffs, the atmosphere sounds like you're in like decapit, kind of dark, kind of sludgy factory, and you're just like drowning in sorrow. That's how that album sounds. I'm like, yeah, that's the perfect sound for industrial metal. What the fuck is Rammstein? We are living in America. It's wonderful. It's called New Deutsch Hard or something. If you go on Rachel Music, it's that genre. But I'm like, yeah, that's industrial metal. New Deutsch Hard. That's just Rammstein. That's just one thing. That's not really a genre. I would argue that's just German metal. But the only relevant German band is Rammstein. So I'm like, it's not good enough, mate. It's not good enough. Just listen to Godflesh. Just listen to Fear Factory. Nine Inch Nails, I would say, is more influential than Rammstein. Rammstein is just a gimmick. I don't think it's even bad, but it's just not really that good. It's just mediocre, I would argue. But that's my opinion. That's the whole take. To kind of stay in that industrial lane, I would argue that Atomizer by Big Black is the most innovative industrial rock album of all time. So, that kind of goes against Nine Inch Nails as well. I grew up on that band, but even I can see that Big Black has a way bigger impact and just does way more for the genre. Because if you go on the charts, it has like 5 different genres, industrial rock, big fuck, which I wasn't aware was a genre, post-hardcore, noise rock, it has so many different genres that it is just very innovative. It's in your face. It's very just noisy and disruptive. I think that's how industrial should sound. That's just the perfect sound for that. So I'm like, yeah, perfect. I think that it beats out Death Grips. I think it beats out Daughters. What else is on there? Clipping. I would argue it's more influential than Clipping. Clipping is still great, but I just think it's more influential and better. Nine Inch Nails, like I said. Coil is also on there. If you go on the charts. Strapping Young Lad, I mean, who listens to that? A lot of people, I presume. Scott Walker is debatable, but Scott Walker was only kind of industrial in like his 2000 era, so I would still say that Big Black is more influential. Daughters, like I said, Nine Inch Nails, Death Grips, yeah. There you go. I think that Big Black still beats out the rest, so that's my opinion. Number 8 is Bands that incorporate electronic elements in their music but are rock bands are usually always bad. So I'm talking about Radiohead's LCD Sound System. You could argue Gorillaz, but I think I still have like one of their albums hanging here. So like Beneath My Treadmill, I believe. But yeah, next to Agalok. But even I have to admit that Gorillaz are kind of all over the place. But that's why I personally like it. But I don't think that is necessarily good electronic music. Good electronic music comes straight from bands that dedicate themselves all the way through that sound. Like Avex Twin, Attacker, Kraftwerk, the Avalanches. I think that all those bands are, those are actual EDM electronic bands. Venetian snares. I still want to get like a vinyl of that, so that's amazing. I do think that all that music is just better. Whereas people that say that, oh, Kid A is my favorite, oh, any LCD Sound System album, I would say Sound of Silver, because that's their most popular. Um, if you say that that's your favorite album, I don't think you know what EDM is. I don't think you know what I don't think that are aware of where music can go if you only listen to Kid A by Radiohead. I don't think you actually know electronic music if that's your favorite, because it can't. It's just too mainstream. And I think that bands that only incorporated a bit into their music but are actually a rock band, I think that's fake. I just think that's fake music. Not to say that Radiohead is a fake band, because when they did their alternative thing, they were fine. I think they were a fine band. I think that Kid A is fine too, but I personally think it's bad electronic music. That and Hill to the Thief. And you could argue in Rainbows, but I'm a bit more forgiving with that, because in Rainbows is like it's partially electronic, it's partially alternative rock. So I'm like, yeah, they kind of incorporate it in their music, but I'm still like, yeah, but it's not good electronic music. I'm like, the songs are fine, but what they do with that, with that EDM side, with that EDM flavor, it's just very tasteless. It's very bland, I think. So that's why I think that bands that do that are bad. You know, not to say the Radiohead is trash or something. I personally don't like them, but their rock side is fine, but whenever they do electronic, or whenever LCD Sound System, whenever you hear a second of that, I'm like, yeah, it sucks. Just don't do electronic music. Like, LCD is a dance band. I still think they suck. Regardless of what they are. But I think that everything they do with electronic music is just bad. It's bad electronic music. You could argue Gorillaz, but Gorillaz were kind of like, they were already kind of a derivative from Portishead and Massive Attack. So that one is kind of debatable. But Radiohead was a rock band. LCD Sound System was a dance band. So I'm like, they're not EDM, they're just not. They don't sound like it. So don't try it, just be that. If you want to be an EDM band, start a different band. That's my opinion. So I think that is a pretty controversial opinion, because everyone lost Kid A, everyone lost those LCD Sound System albums. So I'm like, yeah, I'm definitely in the minority there, but that's just my opinion. Just keep EDM out of rock, and just play rock or EDM. Don't fuse the two. I think that's bad. I think that's bad music, but that's my opinion. That's my whole take. Number 7. Boom bap is boring. And what I mean with boom bap is, of course, the traditional kind of like East Coast, West Coast, 80s and 90s hip hop sound. So you have, what is it? Nas, Tupac, Biggie, Wu Tang Clan, a Tribe Called Quest. I think that is a bit more interesting, because they have those like jazzy elements, but I think that Kendrick Lamar, did it more enjoyable on To Pimp a Butterfly. So I think, he made that album irrelevant. He made Tribe irrelevant with that, but I'm not gonna state that. I just think that personally, he made it irrelevant for me. But Tribe and Wu Tang, like it's good music. I'm not arguing if it's good or bad. I think that Radiohead and LCD Sound System, that's just bad music in my opinion. But Tribe, Wu Tang, Nas, Biggie and Pac, that's all good. I think that's good music, but I don't find it enjoyable to listen to. That's the difference. Like with Radiohead, I just don't enjoy it, and it's bad, in my opinion. And with this hip hop sound, I'm like, yeah, it's all good. I can see why it's good. It has good production. It is tight. It has good lyrics. It's tightly constructed, so I can definitely see why it's good. But I don't enjoy it, so I find it boring. Just having that very conventional kind of layering and kind of like that flow that they have. Nas with Illmatic. I'm like, yeah, that's the Bible of hip hop. That's like the Godfather of hip hop. I'm not gonna argue that. That's the greatest hip hop album of all time. I'm not gonna argue it, but I think it's boring. Yeah, and that's not anything against Nas. That's not anything against hip hop. I love hip hop, but when you present a hip hop album to me, it has to be a bit like poppy, a bit like that Kanye West has, or a bit more jazzy or conscious, like Kendrick Lamar. I enjoy that, but when it's just like straight up boom bap, like Wu Tang, I can listen to it. It's fine, but I'm just really bored by it. I can enjoy a single here and there. I can enjoy a Nas single here and there, but if you put on a whole record, I'm bored. I'm falling asleep. I find that very boring. I think you could also consider that dad rap or grandpa rap, arguably. Well, that's Grandmaster Flash and the Funky Bunch, I believe, and the Sugar Hill Gang. That's actual grandpa rap. So yeah, I think that's also boring, but that's influential. So I respect it. I just don't find it enjoyable music. So call me what you want, call me a poser, call me fake, but yeah, I just enjoy my hip hop a bit more experimental, a bit more industrial. Like with DJ Shadow, he is instrumental and experimental, so I love that. If it has a bit more density and a bit more layers, I just enjoy it more. Not that I think any of that boom bap stuff is derivative, but it's a bit too straightforward for me. I would even argue MF Doom, but he's more abstract, so I still like some Doom, but I think he's a bit overrated. It's not all take, I know, but I'm not here for Doom. I'm here for a boom bap. So there you go. I'm coming with the X to X boom bap or some shit. Number 6, which I would argue is less of a hot take, but it's still somewhat spicy. I think that Tim Buckley is the greatest singer-songwriter of all time. And why I think that is because Tim Buckley has the voice for it. He has the diversity. He has the layers, the density. He just has all these styles that I love. He has the songwriting, the voice. I think that I said that as first. He just has everything incorporated into his music that I love in singer-songwriter. And that's not to call that scene bad, I just think he is the greatest at that because the only one that I was kind of debating with this one was, Nick Drake, because Nick Drake, he has a beautiful singing voice, very melancholic, very relaxing. But I do sense with Nick Drake is that I have to be in a very specific mood to listen to that. If you put that on at broad daylight and I'm happy and I'm hearing Nick Drake, I kind of get depressed. I kind of get, low and I feel a bit distraught because I'm distracted by the somber tone. It's kind of depressing music. but good, like Radiohead. So I still think that Nick Drake is great. I'm not taking anything away from that, but Nick Drake is very very somber and like one tone. So I don't enjoy the musical variety. Whereas with Tim Buckley, he has very soulful tunes. He is very jazzy. Then he has moments where he kind of shrieks like a rat or something. Then he has a bit of a bluesy tone. Then he kind of goes all fucking insane on his bass shreds and shit, or it's like his session players. So I'm like, you can put this on at any occasion. You can put this on at any you know you can throw this on in any mood and you will enjoy it. So I think it has a lot more density, a lot more complexity, and I just think it has endless replay value because there's just so much shit happening on there that I'm like, wow, this is really one of the most innovative singer-songwriter albums ever. I haven't heard a more diverse one. That's not to take away from Leonard Cohen or his son, Jeff Buckley. I think that's also pretty good. But with Jeff, I think that Last Goodbye is a beautiful song. It's one of the greatest songs I've ever heard. But it is very straightforward. So also with Nick Drake, I have to be in a very specific mood to listen to Grace. I do think it's good, but it's just not really my tempo. I just think that Tim is a lot more innovative and just creative with the sounds. He just creates more soundscapes that I enjoy. Bob Dylan, I'm just looking at a chart right now. Bob Dylan, his voice never really fitted me, and his style is just. I think his music style is pretty good, but I could never get behind that voice. I just never liked it personally. That's not really a spicy take, but yeah, I never really enjoyed that. But not a lot of people are saying that especially Star Sailor by Tim Buckley. I think that is the greatest singer-songwriter album of all time. That's what I think. Even something modern like Giles Corey, I think that the atmosphere on that is fine. But I just find the songwriting of Tim Buckley a lot more inspired, a lot more creative, and just the best that the genre has to offer. So I think that is a pretty controversial opinion, but because to most people that album sounds like, you know, Nails on the Chalkboard, but I think it's great. I think it's great music. Another album that is somewhat similar to singer songwriter but different. This is more in the folksy sound, and it also kind of goes against Tim Buckley and Jeff and Nick Drake. I do think that First Utterance by Comus is the greatest folk album of all time. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I have an album cover here. I might do this more often if it's, if you can see it. This album, pretty good cover. It's like a abomination on the cover, but it's great. It has 4 genres: progressive folk, psychedelic folk, and weird folk. And I wasn't even aware that weird folk was a genre, but there you go. Weird with a Y, not with EI. Like you would spell weird, but weird with a short Y. Was not aware that that was a genre. And avant folk as the subgenre. Weird folk is closely tied to mythicism, old folk beliefs, and folk horror, often described as witchy or pagan. So that's pretty interesting. And the second album that is in second is Thunder Perfect Mind by Kurt 93, which is also a great album. But I do think that First Utterance is the undisputed king. It's just the greatest, I think. So I enjoy it more than any Nick Drake, any Jeff Buckley. Like I said, what else is there? Joni Mitchell, Sufjan Stevens, Joanna Newsom. I just think that Comus is just the most enjoyable and just the most innovative player in the folk genre. And I know that's pretty controversial because you have Bob Dylan and Joni and Neutral fucking Milk Hotel. That shit is always more popular, but I think that Comus is just the best. They sound the best to me, at least. So I think this is a pretty hot take because folk is a big genre, but I still think that First Utterance is the best from what I've heard, at least. So there you go. Number 4, which is probably the most controversial opinion yet. Guns N' Roses is more innovative and holds up better than their predecessors. So what I mean with their predecessors is Van Halen, other hard rock bands from that time. Even before that, Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin. I would argue Rainbow because no one really talks about Rainbow. I do think that is a great band though, but I just think that Guns N' Roses has the swagger, the sex, drugs, rock and roll stuff. They were really the last hard rock band to incorporate that style into the music before it got still. I would argue they're better than Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, which is on the hard rock chart here, but I'll get into them a bit later. The Doors definitely better than that. It's not hard to top the Doors. Yeah, Deep Purple, like I said. So not to discredit those bands, those are still great bands, I would argue, except for the Doors. But I just think that Guns N' Roses holds up better. They are more diverse because when the glam era was going on, you could lob them into, a Motley Crue and Aerosmith show, and they would still fit in. And then they would play with, bigger players like with Metallica and Iron Maiden, and they fit in like a glove. It's like the same thing. So I'm like, Guns N' Roses was kind of perfect to be in anything. And I just don't think that a Led Zeppelin or Deep Purple has that diversity. They don't have, I don't think they have that longevity. They don't have that kind of diversion and that catchiness that Guns has. And they don't have the same vocalist as Axl Rose. I think that he has great pipes and that he just has, a very shriek grilled and kind of just great layering and great, delivery in his voice. And I think that Robert Plant was kind of too messy to pull that off. And Sabbath just sang the riff, so I don't think that's all that great. I do think that Ian Gillan is pretty good, but, I don't think that's really the voice of a generation. Axl was the voice of a generation. I do think he really defined that era of music. And in the 90s, he continued with Use Your Illusion. And I think he was innovative in that as well. So it was more so the band than Axl. But on Appetite, he really just was the air raid siren that, you often hear with Iron Maiden and Bruce Dickinson. And I would argue that Maiden was that for metal, but Guns N' Roses was that for hard rock and glam. So I think they were more enjoyable. They were more replayable. They were more accessible for the radio, but they also hit harder. They fit in with more crowds. They fit in with more bands than those other bands. So I'm like, Guns is just the perfect band for that. So I'm like, yeah, they are the best, because they just fit in everywhere. So I'm like, yeah, probably the most overhated band that I know, at least. I'll get into another band that is a bit more hated than them, but Guns N' Roses is definitely, I would say, underappreciated in comparison to a Led Zeppelin, a Deep Purple, a Black Sabbath. Because everyone loves those bands, and Guns is very love or hate. General crowd loves them, the critics hate them. So I'm like, yeah, fuck critics. Guns is great. Suck a dick. That's what Axl would say. So there you go. Great influence. Number 3, which is definitely my hottest take yet. Like I kind of hinted with these older bands, and I'll say this about this band right now. Judas Priest is boring. And I have to kind of let that sit there because if I would say that in a room full of metalheads, I might have lost my head. So I will clarify, I will give some context in what I mean with this. Because, when you hear the word boring, you're just like, oh, they suck. Not necessarily. I don't think that Judas Priest has enjoyable moments in their music, but in general, I find their music very boring, very unmemorable, very straightforward. I think that's the main reason why I don't like Judas Priest. I would even argue Black Sabbath is better because Black Sabbath was more innovative. They had more kind of doomy elements in their music that I just gravitate more towards. Led Zeppelin, sold way more records. They're way more popular. I would say that Robert Plant has more personality to his voice. Rob Halford is definitely an amazing singer. I'm not taking anything away from him. He definitely is one of the greatest vocalists in metal. I'm not taking that away from the band. KK Dowding and the other people, definitely one of the tightest bands ever. But I find it boring. Kind of the same thing with boom bap. It's technically perfect, but I still find it really boring. So that's the reason. I am aware of, I think I have most of their albums on vinyl. I just find them very boring. Beyond the Realms of Death, I think that is a great song. I haven't heard these albums in forever. Painkiller, All Guns Blazing. I think those are great songs, but if you have to hear a whole Judas Priest album, I think it is too straightforward, too derivative, too one-dimensional to really keep listening to it. So people are like, yeah, Judas Priest are one of the most consistent and tight bands ever. I mean, that's mainly because they're doing the same shit over and over. They're kind of like the AC/DC of heavy metal, I would argue, because their music doesn't really change. I think back in the day they had a lot of progression in their music, but nowadays I don't really hear it. I don't find them that interesting. I think that Maiden has more progression in their music. I would argue that Bruce Dickinson is a more enjoyable vocalist. Their albums are just catchier and more. I think they're easier to get into. Not that Judas Priest is bad, like I said, but when I hear it, when I hear British too, I'm like, this is boring. This is boring grandpa rock. That's labeled metal. I just find it really boring personally. And what else is really popular? Screaming for Vengeance. I don't think that's better, but I still find it pretty derivative. So I'm more of a Maiden person. I would even argue Queensryche with Operation Mindcrime is better. I just think it's more conceptual, it's more interesting, it's more progressive, but it's still heavy metal. So I just find that the better album, arguably from both bands. But consistent wise, I just find Maiden more enjoyable. So people can say Judas Priest is better than Maiden. I'm not going to disagree because Maiden has made some stinkers, but on a album to album basis, on a enjoyability basis, I just find Maiden more enjoyable. I don't think that's not unpopular. Maiden is a more popular band, but to say Judas Priest is boring, that's definitely a fucking hot take. So there you go. I just find them really boring. There are a handful of songs that I love, and the rest I can take or leave. I just really don't care for that like really milk toast vanilla heavy metal sound. Not to call Priest milk toast, but milk toast heavy metal, like a very straightforward heavy metal. I'm usually not into that, and Judas Priest kind of represents that sound, and I'm like, yeah, I'm just not really into that, mate. I like it with a bit more doomy elements, like with Black Sabbath, or I like it with a bit more progression, like Maiden. But Judas Priest is just like really straightforward. So I can't appreciate it. I respect it. I just don't like it. My opinion. And my spicy steak, yes, which also kind of lumps into with heavy metal, is that I find Avenged Sevenfold is more enjoyable than almost all vanilla heavy metal bands. I think I said it like that, like all vanilla heavy metal. So there you go, same thing. What I mean with that is that I find that Avenged Sevenfold has more progression. They have more of that metalcore crunch that I really like. And, the vocals are definitely kind of a step down. Like Rob Halford is definitely the best heavy metal singer. I'm not going to debate that. You could debate that with Bruce Dickinson and Rob Halford, but Rob Halford stood the test of time. Whereas with Bruce, you definitely can hear his vocal cords are kind of fried. So I'm like, yeah, Rob is the king. I still find it boring. And Shadows is kind of fried as well, but I just find the music more enjoyable. And those classic albums are still there, so you can still enjoy the classic A7X sound. Wake in the Fallen and City of Evil. I just find the progression in their music. They have kind of like a progressive metal sound with kind of a punk. They kind of have a punk kick, and they come from the metalcore scene, so they have that core crunch. But they are also just straight up heavy metal. So they're kind of like Guns N' Roses. They're kind of a modern Guns N' Roses in the sense of they have a lot of like progressions in their music, but on the surface they're just that. They're just heavy metal. Guns N' Roses is just hard rock. But on the surface, they're a bit bluesy. They are a bit progressive. They have a lot of rhythmic elements that are enjoyable, and that's what makes Guns progressive. That's what makes them fun, in my opinion. A7X just has a lot of progressive elements in their music that I love. That I don't think that Priest has that. I would argue Maiden doesn't even have that. But I like both bands. I think they're both dope. But I think that A7X just took it to another level, and I just think that they innovated heavy metal more. Which that sentence is definitely that would get you crucified on any fucking metal forum. So I'm like, yeah, this arguably is number one. To say A7X is more influential than Judas Priest is definitely a fucking hot take right there. If I said it like that, I will rephrase it. I think that Avenged Sevenfold does more with heavy metal than Judas Priest. I think that Judas Priest is just, they did kind of a bluesy sound. They were usually straight up heavy metal with a bit of progression here and there. What did A7X do? They did metalcore, they did progressive metal, they did heavy metal, they did hard rock. They had a bit of a bluesy kind of tone here and there. They have acoustic elements. What else did they do? With that modern album, they did an avant-garde metal album. I don't see Judas Priest doing that. I'm not saying that all those A7X albums are great, but A7X takes a risk, and that's what I respect about them. They just take a detour from music, and you're like, oh, they listened to Mr. Bungle and maybe some Skinny Puppy. It sounds very industrial and weird, but that's why I like it. They take a risk. And with Priest, it's like, we are this. With ACDC, it's like, we are this. But, to say that about ACDC is not controversial because everyone knows that ACDC is just like a fat, meaty cheeseburger that you take a bite out of and you're like, yeah, I expect that it was fat and juicy, It's enjoyable that way because you're like, yeah, that's ACDC. But a lot of people don't want to say that about Judas Priest because metalheads are elitist as fuck. But yeah, that's what I think about Judas Priest. Judas Priest is definitely more progressive and interesting than ACDC. I'm not saying that, but I find both bands still kind of boring. And A7X, I just find more enjoyable with each listen. It opens up more layers of music every time I hear it. So I just personally find it more enjoyable. And that's why I think that Avenged Sevenfold is more enjoyable than almost every vanilla heavy metal band. You could argue Operation Mindcrime because it is more progressive here and there, but as far as straight up heavy metal goes, I think that A7X beats it out, all of it. So even arguably Iron Maiden, but Iron Maiden are the goats. I'm not shitting on them, but I would say they give them a run for their money. So they should keep it at that. And I don't enjoy Priest. I enjoy a couple of songs, but overall, I find them boring, in my opinion. That could be number one. I had a different number one that was pretty spicy because when I first heard this band, I kind of hated them. I was like, what the fuck is this noise? But nowadays, I'm like, yeah, this is the future of music. And to make a statement like that is spicy in and of itself because most people, don't really look forward or they're not like, oh, I think that this is the future. Most people don't really have that conversation. I think. I think most people just currently enjoy what they like, what's on their plate, and they kind of go back to the past. That's usually what gets enjoyed. People don't look forward to stuff with music at least. That does happen with games, of course, anticipated and pre-releases and shit like that. Um, I don't think it happens with music as well, but let's say less. But I do think that this band is the most innovative bands from their era, and I think they will only get better and better with time. I hope, fingers crossed, because if they can top this, they might get higher up in my chart. And what I mean, of course, is arguably the most controversial thing that I'm gonna say. That's why it's number one. I think that 100 gags and in the bigger picture, hyperpop is the future of music. And that's mainly because it's hyperpop is just like very massive and it's everywhere. And I think it is a very innovative style of music. And because of that, I think that 100 gags will kind of like spearhead that movement. And I think they will push it in a new direction. Because on their couple, I believe on their first album, they were more straight up hyperpop. And on 10,000 gags, my personal favorite, they have a bit of ska punk, power pop, pop punk, geek, new tone, bit ska, bit hyper, bit alternative. I'm like, what are they? It's kind of difficult to put them in a box. That's music what I usually like. If you can't really put it in a box, although I just did that with 10 albums, but besides the point. But you know, the albums and bands that are most difficult to put in that box, I think those are the best artists that experiment the most and that are just really hard to label. And 100 Gex is kind of just everything and nothing. They're kind of like a modern gorillas in a sense. They are so many genres. What even are they? Yeah, on the surface, hyperpop. Gorillas is on the surface, trip hop. So I do understand that, but I do think because 100 Gex is so, I would say, innovative and just interesting with their music. I do think that they will elevate this sound and will take it to new heights. And most people, of course, will say that if you go to the hyperpop genre, like the most influential and like most well-known artist, of course, is Charlie XCX. And I do respect her. I do think that her earlier stuff is pretty good, but when she did hyperpop, I didn't really enjoy it. And the other artists that I see here, Candle Bliss, Tracy Breaks, 8485, underscores, I'm like, I don't know. I don't know these acts. But 100 Gags is massive. That's a massive band. So I'm like, yeah, that is definitely the sound of the future. So, and people don't want to admit that because they're like, alt is better. Oh, I want my hip hop. I want this. I want that. But people also want something new. If something dies out and it's not relevant anymore, it will just die and you will not hear it anymore. Like with rock and metal, like rock and metal can't innovate anymore ever since the 21st millennium. Metal a bit further up until 2010, and then that also wasn't relevant anymore. Hip hop has kind of ups and downs. Pop will always, that's always popular. That's what it stands for. And 100 Gags is, the future of pop music, and pop is the biggest genre. So I'm like, yeah, they are the future of music. That's kind of how I see it. And I think that everyone will disagree with this. That's why it's my number one, because it's, for one, very unconventional and weird. So a lot of people will kind of hate it. I hated it at first. I needed a couple more spins with it. But, pop music is just very bland and dull. And 100 gags is just the opposite of that. They are just everything and nothing. So I think because of that reason, they will kind of just take it over and just take pop to new heights, like I said. So I think for that reason, they are, I think, the most innovative and interesting artist of today. And I think they will only get better and better. I think their albums will age like fine wine. So that might sound like a joke statement, but I really think that. So yeah, take it from me. I hated them, but let it grow on you, and it will be the future of pop music. So that's, I think, my most unpopular opinion, because I'm regarding all music here. I think it will be the most relevant music in the upcoming decades. So that's what I think. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, give me video suggestions on what you would like to see more. And without further ado, I am Ominous voidxvi. Call me what you want, and I will see you in the next video. Enjoy and have a nice day.